Today is November 4th, 2023. The conflict in the Middle East continues to escalate. Israel claims that they have now completely encircled northern Gaza. Let's take a look at the live map. This is liveuamap.com. It is very pro-Western, so please keep that in mind as we take a look at it. This is Israel and the occupied territories. We have to zoom in to Gaza here. As you can see, is quite small along the coast with the Mediterranean Sea, and Israel is focusing now primarily on northern Gaza, where Gaza City and the surrounding areas are located. And we remember that this began with a demand by Israel to evacuate northern Gaza. That's over 1 million people. They began indiscriminately bombing northern Gaza and the rest of Gaza. And I'm not using this term indiscriminate bombing lightly, and I am not just making this up. I just want to make it clear that Israel itself said that they were indiscriminately bombing Gaza, and this comes from The Guardian from October 10th. Emphasis is on damage, not accuracy. It's coming from IDF. Israeli Defense Forces spokesperson Rear Admiral Daniel Hagari made the startling admission that hundreds of tons of bombs had already been dropped on the tiny strip, adding that the emphasis is on damage and not on accuracy. When you're maximizing damage in a civilian populated urban area, ignoring precision, that is indiscriminate bombing by definition. That is what the Israeli military said they are doing. That is why I am calling it indiscriminate bombing. Back to the map. Israel began ground incursions in the north along the coast with the Mediterranean, and then they began this incursion from west to east to completely cut northern Gaza off from the rest of the strip. They have now reached the coast. So they have completed the encirclement, and if you calculate the line of contact between Israeli forces, the militants trapped inside northern Gaza, and also the militants in southern Gaza, it's about 30 kilometers up here and another 6 kilometers here. And compare that to the over 1,000 kilometer line of contact between Russian and Ukrainian forces, just to give you an idea. When we try to compare and contrast what's going on in Ukraine to what is happening in Gaza, it's very important to keep the scale in mind. Now, there's an article that is covering these developments. CNN: airstrikes blast UN shelters, officials say, as Israel announces complete encirclement of Gaza City. The article says nearly a week after Israel first began moving tanks, bulldozers, infantrymen, and combat engineer units into Gaza, Israeli Defense Force spokesman Rear Admiral Daniel Hagari, again, said on November 2nd that Gaza City had been surrounded. The IDF's engineering corps is working to locate and neutralize underground infrastructure, explosives, and other threats so that troops can move more freely, he said. This same CNN article talks about UN-run schools that were sheltering civilians fleeing from this indiscriminate bombing, and they claim 20 people had been killed. Why is Israel indiscriminately bombing Gaza and northern Gaza specifically? In a previous update, I showed you a Financial Times article showing satellite images of the impact of this bombing. They are leveling entire blocks. That is entirely indiscriminate. And they're doing that to create flat, open areas for Israeli forces to operate. Combat in urban areas is always much more difficult, especially for the attacker rather than the defender. To give Israel the advantage, they're simply flattening the terrain. This is very similar to what the US did in Vietnam, using Agent Orange, this toxic chemical they were spraying on the foliage to clear out any hiding spaces for Vietnamese forces. Israel is doing the same thing, but only in an urban environment. Instead of spraying and killing trees, they're bombing people's homes, businesses, even UN-run schools where people are trying to shelter. Israel is steadily losing manpower and equipment as this operation continues. This comes from the Times of Israel. Israeli troops roll into Gaza City as ground offensive intensifies. IDF toll rises. The death toll among IDF troops grew to 19 confirmed deaths since the start of the ground operation 6 days earlier, including a senior officer. Several others were wounded in the fighting, some seriously. We're hearing claims by Hamas that they are destroying Israeli tanks. Others are claiming that that is not true. However, another article from Times of Israel, right here. Senior IDF officer who fought Hamas in Be'er Eri killed in Gaza fighting. Lieutenant Colonel Salman Habaka, 33, commander of the 188th Armored Brigade's 53rd Battalion from the Druze village of Yanujat in the Western Galilee, was killed on Thursday battling Hamas in the northern part of Gaza. So a senior commander of an armored brigade seems to suggest that armored forces are under fire and are taking losses. Now, what is Israel doing? They have encircled northern Gaza. What are they doing? I do not have a battle plan given to me by Israeli forces telling me what their plans are. Previously, in 2008, late 2008, early 2009, Israel conducted a similar operation where they encircled northern Gaza, Gaza City, and then they immediately began ground operations into the city itself to try to clear out Hamas. Is that what they're going to do? We will see in the coming days. We will see if they begin pushing deep into Gaza City like they did during Operation Cast Lead in 2008-2009. However, the other possibility is that they will just maintain this encirclement, slowly strangle the fighters inside northern Gaza, along with the civilian population, which they clearly are not concerned about. And I am hearing a lot about the international reaction. I follow Alexander Mikuris's analysis of this situation daily. He goes in extreme detail into the diplomatic environment that this is all unfolding within. The problem is, what if the administration in Israel is not concerned about Israel's best interests? Very similar to how the administration in Kiev does not have the Ukrainian people's best interests at heart. What if they don't care about the ramifications of their actions? We have to be prepared for that possibility. So we have to wait and see what Israeli forces do next. Are they going to strangle the Hamas fighters trapped in northern Gaza slowly over the course of weeks or even months, and then clear the city when they feel they've been sufficiently depleted? Or are they going to storm in now when Hamas and other militant groups are fresh and well supplied, as they have done in previous operations? Those previous operations, by the way, are often called off as Israeli losses mount. Political capital in Israel is spent, and they have no choice but to call off the operation. What are they going to do? Only time will tell. I will keep an eye on this. Now, there are reports of U.S. involvement in Israel, military involvement, and this comes to us from the New York Times. This first article from October 31st, 2023, American Commandos are in Israel helping to locate hostages, Pentagon says. American Commandos on the ground in Israel are helping locate the more than 200 hostages seized during Hamas's surprise cross-border attacks on October 7th, the Pentagon's top special operations policy official said. U.S. Special Operations Forces are not assigned to any combatant roles in Israel, but they are talking through with their Israeli counterparts what is going to be a very complex fight going forward in Gaza, Mr. Mayor said. So there's that. Are we being told the truth? What are U.S. Special Forces actually doing in Israel? Are they on the ground in Gaza? What does the Pentagon even consider to be Israel versus what would be considered not Israel? Then there's this New York Times article. U.S. drones are flying over Gaza to aid in hostage recovery, officials say. The U.S., this is from November 2nd, U.S. military is flying surveillance drones over the Gaza Strip, according to 2 Defense Department officials and an analysis by the New York Times. The officials said the drones were being used to aid in hostage recovery efforts, indicating that the U.S. is more involved than previously known. The aircraft are the Mk-9 Reapers, operated by U.S. Special Operations Forces, and were first spotted on Saturday on Flight Radar 24, a publicly accessible flight tracking website, though Pentagon officials said that the aircraft have been active in the area since the days after October 7th surprise attack on Israel by Hamas. While Israel frequently conducts reconnaissance flights over Gaza, U.S. defense officials said it was believed to be the first time that U.S. drones have flown missions over Gaza. So a lot of unprecedented U.S. involvement in these operations going forward. And that is within this greater U.S. military buildup in the region that the Pentagon and the rest of Washington, they have openly said is aimed at Iran. So this is what is happening right now in the Middle East between Israel, the Palestinians, their ongoing operation in northern Gaza, the U.S. and its military buildup in the region, and their direct participation in Israeli operations in one way or another. Now, I want to talk a little bit more about what unfolded before the October 7th raids by Hamas. I want to talk more about Hamas in general. I have a lot of people sending me comments, questions in emails, in the comment section of my videos, and I see people trying to understand these events through different types of analysis by an ideology, where they have an ideology and they're filtering everything that they see through that ideology. They're also using analysis by analogy. They're comparing this event with other events, and they try to draw conclusions based on that, and often leaving out crucial context and ignoring very important differences. There's also just analysis by desire, what you desire or wish was happening versus what is actually really happening. And all of these are very flawed ways to look at events unfolding anywhere, including the Middle East. And this is how many people attempted to understand the 2011 Arab Spring. They saw what was going on. They had already picked sides long before that. They wanted to believe that the Arab people were rising up against U.S. and Israeli puppet regimes across the region. They wanted that to be the truth. They ignored evidence to the contrary. They put their support behind these protests, these movements, which the U.S. had planned years in advance and had fully planned to transform into armed violence that the U.S. would then use as a pretext to intervene across the region from North Africa to the Middle East, overthrowing governments, or at least attempting to overthrow governments. And they have created a region-wide crisis that continues to this day. Now, imagine if those people carefully studied the situation, looked at who the leaders were of these protests, saw that they were all receiving U.S. government money and backing for years in advance. If they understood that these militant groups getting involved had been used by the U.S. in the past in similar regime change operations, imagine if the U.S. did not have that widespread initial support behind the Arab Spring that it did indeed have. Imagine how a lot of what the U.S. was trying to do and eventually did in that region, imagine how that may have been blunted and all the death and destruction the region could have been spared. So I want to go over the role of Hamas in the region up until now, its origins. I want to also address not just people who are blindly supporting Hamas because they just want to see justice delivered. I also want to address people who support Israel and say, Israel's just defending themselves. What should they do? Hamas attacked them. What should they do? If not carpet bomb Gaza, because they're honestly trying to defend that. Whether they honestly believe it's defendable or not, that is another story. If Israel truly wanted to get rid of Hamas, eliminate Hamas, they wouldn't have put them into power in the first place. And if they hadn't played a role, which they did, but let's pretend that they didn't play a role in maneuvering Hamas into power in the first place, they need to look at where Hamas gets its public support from. Yes, it's very easy to manipulate people who are destitute, trapped, imprisoned, desperate, angry. It's very easy to manipulate these people emotionally. You put a group like Hamas who claims that they're there to fight for them, and superficially that's what they appear to be doing. The rank and file most certainly believe that that is what they're doing. Then people are going to support Hamas. But if you wanted to deprive Hamas of that support, what would you do? You would look at the reason why Hamas exists in the first place. It is a reaction. It was not created first, and then this problem with Israel followed. There was already a problem with Israel. The United Nations, through multiple resolutions, recognizes Israel as illegally occupying Palestinian territory. They are to leave these occupied territories. They refuse to do so. And as they refuse to do so, amid their occupation, they have carried out crimes against humanity repeatedly, continuously. And this is why people support Hamas. Whatever Hamas is, that is why people support Hamas. If Israel genuinely wanted to eliminate Hamas, they need to eliminate the reason why it exists, which means following international law, ending their occupation, going back to their 1967 borders, and negotiating a two-state solution as they are required to under international law. But they're not doing that. They're doing the exact opposite. They almost seem to be deliberately giving Hamas a reason to exist so that people will continue supporting it. Why is that? Why do you think that is? We've heard plenty of pro-Palestinian voices try to explain why, but I'm showing you Haaretz. This is an Israeli newspaper, and they will explain to you why that is. The title of this is even, why did Netanyahu want to strengthen Hamas? And this was October 11, 2023. So Israel is far from being unified over the narrative surrounding this current conflict. They're far from united in support of the current government. This article will explain to you the role Israel played in maneuvering Hamas into power. And please listen very carefully. And keep in mind, as I'm reading this to you, this is Israeli media. The deep roots of the feasibility of the murderous assault by the Islamist nationalists from the prison that is Gaza on Israeli citizens should actually be sought in an earlier period of Benjamin Netanyahu's time in office as prime minister, prior to his criminal trial and his alliance with nationalist Kahanists and the judicial coup, back when he was considered level-headed and rational and responsible, all in quotation marks. Netanyahu developed and advanced a destructive, warped political doctrine that held that strengthening Hamas at the expense of the Palestinian Authority would be good for Israel. The purpose of the doctrine was to perpetuate the rift between Hamas in Gaza and the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank. That would preserve the diplomatic paralysis and forever remove the danger of negotiations, danger in quotation marks, of negotiations with the Palestinians over the partition of Israel into two states on the argument that the Palestinian Authority doesn't represent all the Palestinians. So by putting extremists who reject the two-state solution, you can prevent the danger of negotiations toward a two-state solution. And they're putting danger into quotation marks because they themselves don't believe that that is an actual real danger. It continues, that flawed strategy turned Hamas from a minor terrorist organization into an efficient, lethal army with highly trained, dehumanized stormtroopers, bloodthirsty killers who mercilessly slaughtered innocent Israeli civilians, including women, children, and the elderly. This is solidly documented. Between 2012 and 2018, Netanyahu gave Qatar approval to transfer a cumulative sum of about $1 billion to Gaza, at least half of which reached Hamas, including its military wing. According to the Jerusalem Post, in a private meeting with members of his Likud party on March 11, 2019, Netanyahu explained the reckless step as follows. The money transfer is part of the strategy to divide the Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank. Anyone who opposes the establishment of a Palestinian state needs to support the transfer of the money from Qatar to Hamas. In that way, we will foil the establishment of a Palestinian state, as reported in former cabinet member Chaim Ramon's Hebrew language book, Neged Haroch. If I'm pronouncing that wrong, my apologies. And then it continues. In an interview with the Ynet News website on May 5th, 2019, Netanyahu associate Gershon Hachkohen, a major general in reserves, said, "We need to tell the truth. Netanyahu's strategy is to prevent the option of two states. So he is turning Hamas into his closest partner. Openly, Hamas is an enemy. Covertly, it's an ally." How much clearer could this possibly be? Israel maneuvered Hamas into power because it was an extremist organization that rejected the two-state solution. The current administration in Israel also rejects the two-state solution by putting a belligerent and irrational actor into power in Gaza, ensured continuous, perpetual pretexts to wage conflict rather than negotiate peace toward a two-state solution. And a lot of people are saying, but Brian, this October 7th raid, it humiliated Israel, caught them off guard, it proved that the Israeli military is incompetent, which now I think in hindsight it does not really stand. This was blowback. It was not blowback. And as a matter of fact, it is precisely part of the plan. The October 7th raids put us a step closer to just simply annihilating Gaza rather than toward negotiating to a two-state solution. Here is another, I mean, some people might say, well, Brian, that's just one article from Israeli media. Here's a second one from an entirely different author, A Brief History of the Netanyahu-Hamas Alliance. This is from October 20th, 2023. For 14 years, Netanyahu's policy was to keep Hamas in power. The pogrom of October 7, 2023 helps the Israeli prime minister preserve his own rule. Exactly. And just think about it. There were protests before the October 7th raids. The raids unfold. Now there's a unity government. Think about that for a moment. Much ink has been spilled describing the long-time relationship, rather alliance, between Benjamin Netanyahu and Hamas. And still, the very fact that there has been close cooperation between the Israeli prime minister with the support of many on the right, the fundamentalist organization, seemingly evaporated from most of the current analyses. Everyone's talking about failures, mistakes, and fixed conceptions. Given this, there is a need not only to review the history of cooperation, but also to conclude unequivocally the pogrom of October 7, 2023 helps Netanyahu, and not for the first time, to preserve his rule, certainly in the short time. And I think that this is a convincing argument that is made, as with the previous op-ed. Read both pieces. And I believe that this gives additional weight to those who are saying that the October 7th raid was known, was detected by Israeli intelligence, who were ordered to stand down. This op-ed continues. It says, the method of operation of Netanyahu's policy since his return to prime minister's office in 2009 has and continues to be, on the one hand, bolstering the rule of Hamas in the Gaza Strip, and on the other hand, weakening the Palestinian Authority. For over a decade, Netanyahu has lent a hand in various ways to the growing military and political power of Hamas. Netanyahu is the one who turned Hamas from a terror organization with few resources into a semi-state body. And something that I've heard Alex Christoporo and Alexander Micuris of the Durand state very often, Israel declaring war on Hamas solidifies in the mind of people that it is a state rather than a terrorist organization. You don't declare war on a terrorist organization, you declare war on another state. You conduct an anti-terror operation against a terrorist organization. I think that's a very good point to keep in mind. This op-ed continues, releasing Palestinian prisoners, allowing cash transfers as the Qatari envoy comes and goes to Gaza as he pleases, agreeing to the import of a broad array of goods, construction materials in particular, with the knowledge that much of the material will be designated for terrorism and not for building civilian infrastructure, increasing the number of work permits in Israel and for Palestinian workers from Gaza, and more. All of these developments created some symbiosis between the flowering of fundamentalist terrorism and preservation of Netanyahu's rule. Take note, it would be a mistake to assume that Netanyahu thought about the well-being of the poor and oppressed Gazans, who are also victims of Hamas, when allowing the transfer of funds, some of which, as noted, didn't go to building infrastructure, but rather military armament. His goal was to hurt Abbas and prevent division of the land of Israel into two states, to prevent the two-state solution. And on this last part about Hamas redirecting resources to military matters rather than civilian infrastructure, they themselves published videos of cutting up water pipes to turn into rockets. Now, people have to understand that this is not about denying the Palestinian people's right to resist. The UN says Israel is occupying Palestinian territory. The Palestinian people have a right to take up arms and expel the occupation. It's very simple. But what they're explaining is that Hamas is not a resistance organization. It is meant to fill up the void where an actual genuine resistance organization should be. And they are using Hamas to advance their own foreign policy objectives at the expense of both the Israeli people and also the Palestinian people. And they are spelling it out and they are admitting it. And if you look carefully at what is really happening rather than what you wish was happening, it's very clear that that is what is happening. Now, I want to talk about Hamas and the Muslim Brotherhood. I want to talk about how the US has used Al-Qaeda and also ISIS in an exact same way. They used it in Iraq to divide armed resistance against US occupation from 2003 onward. They used these extremists to stir up sectarian violence that divided a united resistance against US occupation and transformed the violence in Iraq into a civil war, essentially. The US, before Al-Qaeda, used the Muslim Brotherhood for decades to stir up violence in countries the US wanted regime change in. They did this in Syria in the 70s and 80s. They wanted to remove Syrian President Bashar al-Assad's father from power. They used the Muslim Brotherhood, who had armed factions. They took up arms and they were fighting and killing Syrian soldiers, and they were attempting to overthrow the Syrian government. The Muslim Brotherhood was used again in preparation for the 2011 Arab Spring. I want to remind people of this 2007 Seymour Hersh article in the New Yorker, "The Redirection: Is the Administration's New Policy Benefiting Our Enemies in the War on Terrorism?" And in this first two paragraphs, it explains how the US has taken part in clandestine operations aimed at Iran and its ally Syria. A byproduct of these activities has been bolstering of Sunni extremist groups that espouse a militant vision of Islam and are hostile to America and sympathetic to Al-Qaeda. And the Muslim Brotherhood is mentioned in this article as the perfect candidate in both Egypt and Syria for the US to use to reshape the region, to expel governments they don't like and replace them with more pliable client regimes. And that's exactly what the US did. So that was 2007. That was Seymour Hersh warning people that the US was preparing militants ahead of some sort of proxy war, a regional proxy war to be waged against Iran and its allies. That proxy war began in 2011 under the cover of US trained, equipped, and funded activists, the Arab Spring, and it quickly devolved into armed fighting and eventually US interventions, even invasions and occupations. So the US used the Muslim Brotherhood in the 70s and 80s. They used it more recently from 2011 onward. Hamas stems from the Muslim Brotherhood. And people might wonder, Brian, how do you know that? How do you know that? This is from Yale Law School, the Avalon Project, Documents in Law, History, and Diplomacy. This is the Hamas Covenant, 1988. It says, Article 2, the Islamic resistance movement is one of the wings of the Muslim Brotherhood in Palestine. Muslim Brotherhood movement is a universal organization which constitutes the largest Islamic movement in modern times. And just to give you an example of the role that the Muslim Brotherhood played in all of this, they formed the core of the armed violence in Egypt, mixed in with these activists that the US funded and were supporting to go out into the streets and protest. During the 2011 protests, there was also a lot of violence that was carried out by the Muslim Brotherhood. And they ultimately helped overthrow the Egyptian government in 2011, just like US-backed opposition groups and also Nazi militias helped overthrow the Ukrainian government in 2014. Here is the end result of all of this. In 2013, Muslim Brotherhood presidential candidate Mohamed Morsi became president of Egypt, and one of the first things that he did was cut ties to Assad regime and call for support of the rebels. And it says, Egypt has announced increased support for the armed uprising against Syrian President Bashar al-Assad, cutting diplomatic ties to the Damascus regime and holding a massive rally to drum up funds and potential fighters for the effort. President Mohamed Morsi, a Sunni Islamist, told thousands attending the rally at Cairo Stadium that the Arab world's most populous nation would stand with the Syrian revolution against Mr. Assad's Alawite Muslim regime, which is mostly drawn from a Shia minority sect. And this is all nonsense, this idea that this was all religiously motivated. No, the so-called uprising against the Syrian government was organized by the US. The militants fighting and killing the Syrian military and Syrian civilians were being armed and backed by the US. So this was this Muslim Brotherhood president of Egypt, Mohamed Morsi, pretending like he's standing up for the Islamic religion when he's just a proxy of US political machinations in the region. He's enlisting Egypt in this US proxy war against Syria. So it wasn't just the Muslim Brotherhood, it was also Hamas itself. And I've pointed this out many times, but it is worth repeating it. This is from Reuters. 2012, Hamas ditches Assad, backs Syrian revolt. Leaders of the Palestinian Islamist movement Hamas turned publicly against their longtime ally, President Bashar al-Assad of Syria, endorsing the revolt aimed at overthrowing his dynastic rule. So the Muslim Brotherhood and Hamas were acting as one. They were making the same decisions. They were contributing to the same US-backed efforts to overthrow the Syrian government. Now, finally, I want to point something else out. The original Hamas covenant talks about eradicating Israel. It openly admits that it is a Muslim Brotherhood affiliate. In 2017, and that's what this Reuters article talks about from 2017, Hamas to soften stance on Israel, Muslim Brotherhood, Arab sources. The Palestinian Islamist group Hamas will drop its long-standing calls for Israel's destruction as well as its association with the Muslim Brotherhood and a new policy document to be issued, Gulf Arab sources said. Now, even though Hamas, even in its 2017 revision, does not recognize Israel, they're recognizing the 1967 borders, which de facto recognizes Israel. They just don't want to say it openly. As far as the Muslim Brotherhood goes, they simply don't mention the Muslim Brotherhood. They don't condemn it. They don't officially break with the Muslim Brotherhood. They just don't include it in their revised charter. Now, here's something that I have pointed out before, others have been talking about. Hamas, number one, is not a monolithic organization. has many different political and militant factions, and there is disagreement, especially now more than ever. Hamas, a lot of people tell me, Brian, you always deny everybody's agency. It's always the US or some other country intervening and influencing everything. But the reality is, if you preside over the Gaza Strip, there are no resources there for you to use to be independent of whoever it is giving you money and supplies so that you can exist. You are a vector sum of all of these external interests and countries sending you money, sending you supplies. And I've talked about how everyone is trying to influence Hamas. The West and their Arab allies are attempting to influence and use Hamas. Iran is trying to pivot Hamas away from its previous trajectory toward a more genuine resistance movement that can play a constructive role rather than an obstructive role in this whole process. But the vector sum of Hamas still is, clearly by looking at what it has done more recently and how these October 7th raids play right into Israel's strategy of eradicating Gaza rather than recognizing it and negotiating toward a two-state solution. It's very clear that the vector sum of influence on Hamas is putting it on a path, making it part of the problem, not the solution. Now imagine if, when Hamas carried out the raids on October 7th, you had people in Israel and people who support the Palestinian cause all recognizing the origins of Hamas, its track record, and the fact that those raids served rather than impeded Israeli interests, the current administration of Israel's interests. If they were all able to point that out, they could have blunted this. They could have maybe not stopped it, but they could have certainly diminished the free reign the Israeli administration now operates with. But instead, people were so desperate for emotional satisfaction, for revenge against Israel and the very real injustices that it imposes on the Palestinian people. They wanted to believe that Hamas carried out this spectacular, successful attack on Israeli forces, which, when you look at militarily, were, the Israeli losses were negligible, didn't impede their subsequent operations in any way. You have people who are trying to justify what Hamas has done, spin what Hamas has done, deny what they did. And all it does is help fuel this conflict further. You have people on both sides who are just radicalizing even further following the October 7th raids, rather than moving away from this strategy of tension, trying to genuinely examine its components, the source of this problem, and how to solve it. Finally, I just want people to remember that Israel is just one of several US proxies. The US is still waging a proxy war against Russia and Ukraine and Eastern Europe, and they're still stirring up trouble in Asia Pacific against China, both in the island province of Taiwan and also the Philippines, which I will be covering here real soon, hopefully later this week. Until then, if you thought this video was useful, please like and share. Think about subscribing. It's free to do. It helps the channel grow. Check the video description below for other places you can find and follow my work. All the links that I reference in this video are also there, as well as ways you can help support my work. I don't monetize my YouTube channel. If an ad pops up, feel free to skip it. It isn't helping me out at all. If you do want to help support my work, please do so through Buy Me a Coffee and also Patreon. To everyone who has been supporting my work, whether it's one-time donations, donations month to month, or even if you're just sharing my work with others, that is all greatly appreciated. That is what makes this work possible. So thank you. As always, thank you for watching.